moment of our opportunity. We're very honored to have Dr. St. Clair with us today, who is the faculty at St. Cloud University. And I had a chance to hear her maybe a year ago over on the St. Paul campus. And I was taking notes so fast and furious that I've got to have her back again so that there's more of us that can talk about what she was sharing, because it was absolutely what we need to know to move us to the next level. So welcome in celebration of Earth Day. I've got my Earth Day shirt on, but it really is the acknowledgement that as we move forward in our whole understanding as what is health, health is the health of people, obviously, the health of community, the health of societies, the health of the planet is all connected, and you cannot have health of individuals when our individuals are not treated well. So that's why I'm so glad that she's going to be bringing us forward into our conversation today. As I've shared on other times, just a reminder that we're standing on the ancestral lands of the Dakota people, that this is really important for us to understand the background of where the university sits and resides, and our obligation as people who work and study and are here to honor the original people. So Dr. St. Clair has drafted for the University of Minnesota a statement, and I'm just going to read it because it's far more eloquent than what I say. University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. Minnesota comes from the Dakota name for this region, Minnesota, Makoche, the land where the waters reflect the skies. Each day, students, faculty, staff, and community members who use our services look out our windows to the Wakpa River of the waterfalls. The Circle of Indigenous Nations recognizes the original peoples of this place and makes ongoing efforts to educate the campus community about the ongoing relationship that the Dakota people have to this area. We too need to remember that ongoing relationship and bring that forward in all the care that we do to serve the people. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Hami dakuyapi petu kinde chante washte na pechu zampie ye kiapi we demi washichu ia Darlene St. Clair e makiapi. Damakota chashaya pihemata hawana chekpa ontue adwati ikche we chashto wa unspe we chakya hemacha St. Cloud wonspe wa kantia et tawani. Petu kinde iuski awachiakapi. Hello, my relatives. Today I greet you with a good-hearted handshake. And this is typically what I would greet, the way you would greet people in sort of a formal setting like this. I said I'm Iekiapiwi. That's my Dakota name, and that's my real name, Iekiapiwi. My Washichu name is Darlene St. Clair, and I am Dakota. I'm from Chashayapi. Chashayapi translates to they paint the trees red. And this is a place in Minnesota where the Lower Sioux Reservation is located. So I'm originally from Lower Sioux, but now I live in the Twin Cities, and I'm a teacher. I teach Native Studies at St. Cloud State University. And I'm also the director of the Multicultural Research Center, which is an academic center that focuses on race and people of color in the United States. So I want to thank Professor Potter for inviting me today. The opportunities to it's a great opportunity for me to sort of talk about the intersections of sort of the work that I do in terms of Native studies and then anti-racism. And I have been sort of forming sort of some ideas about this. So any opportunity to sort of share this idea with other folks and get feedback is a real benefit to me. So first we're going to start with worldview. So worldview is a tough thing. Because it is the lens that we actually always see the world in, it's hard for us to notice what is specific or to even to describe it. Typically, we might say, how do we see the world? How do we interpret and make meaning of the way we live in the world? We might say this is our defaults, and these are things that we were socialized into. If I were to sort of describe Dakota worldview to you, I I would start by referring to this concept, Dakota Wichocha. Wichocha means ways of life or ways of living. And central to our Wichocha, central to our ways of life, is this idea, this concept of mitakrie oasi. And I'm going to go into these a little bit more. Another one is this idea of relationality or kinship. These are critical. What is the meaning of the word Dakota? And ikche wichashta. So I'm going to go through these concepts and sort of unpack them and what they mean. I do want to mention, though, in a Dakota worldview, there are multiple right answers. And that is a real shift. We might say, oh, of course I think that way. But most of us who went to school in either an American or Western or European setting are sort of socialized into seeing things dualistically. So dualism meaning yes or no, true or false, right or wrong. And that kind of dualism is very dominant in the way that we think. And so I'm asking you to sort of, in thinking of a Dakota worldview, there are multiple right answers. So someone say there are multiple paths to the same truth. So the first concept I want to talk about is this one about this place that we live in, Minnesota Makoche. So this is the name that Dakota people called this region. Of course, we called it this before there was a colonial bordered state of Minnesota. So this concept predates the United States. Mini, meaning water. Sota is sort of the reflection of the clouds, or it could be cloudy. And Makoche meaning land. So Minnesota Makoche is sort of what we call this region. And then the region itself actually extends beyond what we think of the borders of Minnesota. But of course, everything in Minnesota we would have called Minnesota Makoche. The next concept I want to talk about is this mitakue oasim. Now this translates to we are all related or all my relations. Now, when we say this, who are the relatives that we are referring to? It would include the land, other humans, of course, animals, plants, stars, rocks, spirits. In fact, some of my elders would say everything that is seen and unseen would be in this understanding of who is your relative. In fact, we often traditionally talk about aspects of sort of our relatives as having sort of agency. So we might refer to the Wichach Bi Oyate, the star nation, as having, or the plant nation, and that they have interests and agency and are more than resources. So that's one concept, Mitakue Oasi, and it includes, it's about all are my relations. Mitakue means my relative, Oasi is everything, all. Now, if we think about this concept and kind of how it works, where do people fit in this? We have a deep understanding in the traditional Dakota thought that the individual depends on community. The idea, and so once again, this is like shifts in worldview, because this idea of like an individual, I can do it on my own, I don't need anyone else, it's my individual effort and agency. That is very dominant narrative in the United States. Sometimes people would attach that to this idea of meritocracy, which is everything that we have because we worked hard and we deserve it. These are sort of actually very sacred philosophical beliefs in the United States, and these things do come in conflict when we think about race. So individual depends on the community 100%. In a Dakota philosophy, there's no like, I'm going to do it on my own, I don't need anybody else. Somebody with that mindset is assumed to be dead Dakota, because the idea is that we are completely dependent on the community for our survival. Then there is a belief that the community depends on nature. And when I say that, I mean completely depends on nature. I think because of things like manufacturing and technology, and even just the idea that the things in the earth are resources for us, that sort of distances ourselves from our true dependence on nature. So everything that we have comes from nature. While even though it appears that this is not a thing that grew on a tree, we know that everything we have comes from the earth. So there's a complete dependence on nature. But we also believe that nature is dependent on the spirits for its well-being and its health. And so then that's where an individual comes back into play. Because an individual has those sorts of connections and has the capacity to sort of communicate with the spirit through prayer and ceremony and living Dakota Way Chocha. So we see Mitakue Owasin kind of in a reciprocal sort of a cycle of relationships where everyone is sort of working together. Kinship is similar, sort of a related concept, but I want to talk about kinship as also being a little different. So if we think of also who our relatives are, in a Western worldview, we typically think of kinship as sort of what we might call our blood relatives. These are people we're related to by blood. That's the concept that we have. In a Dakota worldview, kinship is more about allegiance than it is about ancestry or blood. It's more about the relationship and the loyalty or the commitment. That means you can have relatives that are not your biological relative, and that those relationships are just as important. In fact, this idea of being a relative is really critical to the way Dakota people think. In fact, one of our central teachings is that to be a good Dakota person is to be a good relative. We use kinship terms to sort of define roles and responsibilities. And so there are lots of people that I would use a relative term like cousin or uncle or grandmother that are not my biological relatives. And in addition, many Dakota people refer to other parts of creation as their relatives as well. We refer to Inamaka, Mother Earth, Tukanshira or Wakantanka. Tukanshira is a grandfather spirits. So we have these other, we also use kinship terms to describe things beyond humans. The term Dakota, traditionally, we think of that as the name of a tribe. It also is the name of a language or a dialect of a language, but it really translates to mean friend or ally. And I think that's really important because we see how this interest in alliance is very critical to a Dakota way of thinking and looking at the world. So we're oriented towards alliances. We understand that we need allies, especially today when our numbers are so small. And so if you are somebody who is seeking out alliances, the first thing you start thinking about when you meet someone else that's different than you is to think about what are our commonalities. And I think that is also a common shift, a common difference, a way of thinking. So it's like, in what way? And I remember sort of growing up, every time I met someone else, they were trying to sort of figure out some way we were relatives. And that might have been biological, but it also might have been, you're friends with the person that I know, or you lived in a place that I lived, or you care about a thing that I care about. And so it's this interest in making relatives and making alliances, because that is really key to our survival. That's a Dakota philosophy. So being part of a community that's in balance is key to our survival. That's critical. And then there's another word, Wo Dakota, which sort of uses that term, and it's the Wo maybe simply would say is kind of like adds like the concept of NESS, like Dakota-ness. So so that's about peace. Sometimes they would refer to peace treaties as something that was connected to Wo Dakota. The alliance, the time or state of peacefulness or Dakota-ness, those are all could be described as Wo Dakota. So, this is common in every community, is that we have values, and sometimes our values are very stated, And sometimes our values people don't claim, but you can see in their behavior what their values are. So we use values to guide us and help make decisions. There is a great value in Dakota Worldview and the Dakota Way of considered decision making. And so considered decision making is very time consuming. Considered decision making takes a lot of time and can be really drawn out. So this differs from a majority rule way of making decisions. This would be, the preference would be to sort of work together and do that work until we can get to a place where people in the room can agree on what is the best decision. So that the consideration is time consuming and can be very difficult, but that is important. There is a recognition for sure that Dakota people live into these stated values very imperfectly. We don't always do them very well. And of course, these values are not owned by Dakota people. In fact, lots of people share these values. And so, but I think the thing I want to talk about is sort of in terms of worldview. You know that there are people who you can see their values in action. The way that they act, you can say what their values are. Many people would say that, there are a few people that would say amassing the most stuff would not, there are not many people would say that is their value, but we see that we sometimes see that behavior. So we have to, it's not just about people's stated values, but it is looking at their actions. So here are some of these potential values that are commonly sort of brought up when we talk about what are some of these Dakota values. And again, so these are things that many people share. These are not owned by Dakota people. But the idea is that the values that you state that are important to you, there should be evidence of you living these values in your actions. The main last concept I want to talk about is kind of a harder one. It's ikjewichashta. And ikjewichashta translates to common person. It really is common man, but it can be common person. And when we say common in English, it has a real, it has a sense about it, about what that means, what common means. I would say common means that it recognizes that there's a hierarchy and that common people in the hierarchy are at the bottom of the hierarchy, right? So we have a strong association in English with the word common. It does not mean that in Dakota, however. In fact, the teaching is to become an ikjewichashta, that this is a goal of Dakota people. We want to become a common person, but you don't just get born to be a common person. You actually have to strive and struggle and work to become a common person. A common person recognizes that their individual efforts are really there to benefit the community. So another concept, so many other tribes will refer to, when they're talking about sort of personhood or something like that, they might talk about a real human being or a true human being. And that idea is much more connected to ikjewichashta. It's kind of like, how do we live into our greatest capacity as human beings? If we think a certain tree has a capacity, and how does it live into its greatest capacity? A certain animal has its capacity. How does it live into its greatest capacity for what it was created for? And in the same way, human beings have what is our greatest capacity? How do we live into that? Now, for us to think about ikjewichashta and thinking about that struggle and that striving over life to become one, we also have to think about that true human being sort of is connected to this idea of humanity. So in our lives, how have we been dehumanized? And how have we dehumanized others? Because to become an ikjewichashta, you have to sort of do that mental work, that emotional work, that like work in the world about how is it that I've been dehumanized and how do I address that? How is it that I've dehumanized others and how do I address that? So it's in this concept that I think we also see more real connection to anti-racism. And what does it take to address dehumanization? So, just a very brief overview. If we were to think of colonization, and the kind of colonization we experience here in the United States is called settler colonialism, how does that sort of have an ongoing impact on Native people? And so this is one way for us to think about the ways that Native people have been dehumanized, and it does sort of call into order just for non-Native people and for Native people, how do we address these impacts? So this is just sort of thinking about land loss as one example. So if we think about what are the impacts of land loss on Dakota people throughout our history, land loss impacts our relationships with other living things and with spirits. So as we talked about, like the relationships, that kinship, that mitakuye concept, it requires us to sort of be in relationship with other living things and with spirits. And when you have a disconnection from your land, it impacts your capacity to live into that relationship that we've been given, that responsibility. So crucial connections that impact the long-term well-being of individuals and communities, this comes from land loss. It comes from the disruption of the relationship of Native people to those living things, those spirits. Traditional roles and responsibilities are disrupted. We think of land loss as having an impact on our access to sacred sites, our ability to practice traditional ways, that include food ways, healing practices, the resources, access to resources that are needed for these traditional practices. Land loss impacts language, especially the language related to places. If you no longer have access to these places, the stories of these places, the language about these places starts to get lost or forgotten. So language related to place and the oral tradition related to place. And then Native economies. Our economies just in general, our Indigenous institutions are undermined consistently by colonization. So while we think of institutions as being something that's sort of more modern, Indigenous people, Dakota people, had healthcare institutions, had education institutions, had religious institutions in the same way that we have in the United States today, but they have been undermined and chipped away at through colonization and through land loss specifically. So let's talk about, at this point, I've really only talked about kind of a Dakota worldview, like what's a worldview and now a Dakota worldview. I want us to think about sort of this idea of like bringing in concepts around anti-racism. So if you do this work or if you're engaged in this work, there can be sort of a confusion between the difference between multiculturalism and anti-racism. So some of the benefits or some of the features of multiculturalism are multiculturalism challenges Euro-American domination of knowledge with the call to bring in other perspectives. Multiculturalism focuses on diversity. Multiculturalism is often celebratory, like how do we celebrate the diversity of the place that we live? However, multiculturalism is often also colorblind. I'll talk about that in a bit. Multiculturalism generally does not talk about power, doesn't necessarily specifically speak to power. And multiculturalism doesn't really call for us to change beyond tolerance of that diversity. So that's kind of, I think, the tenets, or what I think of when I think of multiculturalism. Anti-racism is slightly different, and this is what I'm advocating for. So that in anti-racism, we're understanding that race and racism is baked into all of our institutions. Every American institution, all of the disciplines that we have been trained in nursing, in healthcare more broadly, race and racism is baked into those institutions from the very beginning. It's an assumption and understanding that race is constructed, meaning race has not always been here. Racism has not always been here. Racism is not something that we cannot work to eliminate because we created it, we can uncreate it. Anti-racism recognizes that all of us are racialized into this system, even if we're not aware of it, even if we didn't ask for it, even if we don't want it, even if we want to reject it. We have all been racialized into this system. Anti-racism is going to require a much more complex analysis and considering of intersectionality. And by that, I don't mean that we're all just, we have diverse identities, but that intersectionality is really calling us to understand the intersections and the sort of the multiplication of oppressions and social location. It requires us to develop critical analytical skills that always include an analysis of power. Anti-racism is going to focus on praxis, meaning theory into practice. So it's not just, you just don't learn content and then you're done. How is it that you're bringing that knowledge into action, into your work, into your life? So this is sort of more of a definition of anti-racism. Now, I don't know if anyone's going, but this Friday, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who's a professor at Duke, is speaking at Kauffman, and he wrote this really great book that I'd like to recommend called Racism Without Racists. And he is challenging people to sort of think about, in the United States, we have like an understanding that being called a racist is like the worst possible thing. It's the worst thing you could ever be called. Because racists are bad people. Racism means individual acts of conscious and unconscious meanness. Racists are mean. And I think he's really trying to unpack that and challenge this understanding. To consider that, no, racism is the default. And you don't have to be intentionally racist to perpetuate and support racist inequality. You don't have to be a bad person. You don't have to be a mean person. You don't have to be intending it. And I think this is really critical. And there's no way that we don't get to be the people who are outside of a racist system. And that's another thing that comes with that sort of that colorblind ideology. Another concept that I think is helpful in thinking about anti-racism is Beverly Tatum, who talked about, used a moving walkway metaphor. So she would say, like the moving walkway at the airport, for example. If you're walking on the moving walkway, you just zoom by. Your speed is just multiplied. And so she might say that active racism is sort of like walking on the moving walkway. But if you get on the moving walkway and you don't walk, you stand still on the moving walkway, you are still moving forward in the same exact direction. And this is the part where we have people who might call themselves, well, I didn't do that. I didn't do a racist thing. But if you are sort of what we might call a non-racist, which means, we have like the active racism, we all have an idea of what that is. But many of us might be really just living as non-racist, meaning we don't do anything. We don't have an intentional racist act, but we often don't speak out. And that non-racism is still upholding the system that we currently have. Standing on the moving walkway, that passive racism continues to uphold the system we currently have. It does require that you do the very challenging and difficult and uncomfortable work of walking the opposite direction on the moving walkway. And that is what we might call anti-racism. And that's that intentional. It's easy to stand on the moving walkway and do nothing. You don't even have to think about it. But if you were walking the opposite direction on the moving walkway, you're going to run into people like, what are you doing? Get out of my way. You're not doing this right. You are disrupting me. And so it's those kinds of, that discomfort is part of that anti-racism. So one of the projects that I've been working on as a faculty member is anti-racist pedagogy. So how is it as instructors, how is it as teachers that we use sort of anti-racist values and express them in our teaching roles? So anti-racist pedagogy would include things like examining those theories, those structures, those practices. And those are things that are baked into the disciplines that we are all part of. Raising self-awareness regarding power, our social locations, and the way knowledge is produced. That we look deeply at those factors and look for where race is woven in there. Anti-racist pedagogy part of true anti-racist pedagogy is empowering students to not just have the role as learner or content absorber, but that they also have a role in their own learning and they have a role in the learning of all of us. Developing critical thinking and anti-racist practices, so this is something that needs to be intentional. And I think one of the really big ones is community building. That you cannot have these kinds of conversations in a classroom that hasn't intentionally sought out building community in the classroom. One of my colleagues at St. Cloud State University wrote a really good sort of introductory article on anti-racist pedagogy, and I strongly recommend, if this is something you would like to engage in more deeply, she wrote a great article that I think is really accessible. So, anti-racist pedagogy from faculty self-reflection to organizing within and beyond the classroom. So I'd like to recommend that. So I think that we start thinking about the harms. So who is harmed by racism? And are the harms experienced in the same ways with the same impacts? I would certainly argue no. People of color and Indigenous people, how are they impacted? And how are white people impacted? And I feel like much of the narrative of understanding race, and especially in considering power dynamics, is that certainly we understand the way white people have privileges in certain settings. And of course, with intersectional analysis, we understand that we don't experience those privileges all in the same way, for sure. But at the same time, I also would argue that white people are harmed by racism. These kinds of conversations, I think, are really critical to doing anti-racist work in society. Now, I want you to talk, and maybe the few people that are sitting next to you. So this is the part where I'm asking you to sort of really think about the analysis that I've presented and think about how it may or may not make sense. So the first question that I'm going to ask of you is, how do Dakota Way Choha, these things that I presented, that worldview, the relationality, the values, how does that relate or intersect with anti-racist values and practice? Where are there lessons for us as we make efforts to address racism? And how might shifts in paradigm, sort of the way your worldview or the way you see the world, how may that impact our actions as anti-racists? So I'm thinking, and so this is kind of the work that I'm thinking about now. These are the questions that I'm asking in this kind of project for me that is kind of ongoing. So our work is, where are there spaces or places in our work where the intersections of these frameworks are relevant or helpful in your work, meaning the work that you do? Where might there be places where an intersection of the Dakota Way Chohan anti-racism might make sense? In what ways, in your efforts to be anti-racist or to address issues of racism, in what ways might that Dakota worldview make sense in developing an analysis? So let's use Dakota Way Chohan to think through these issues, concerns, barriers, incidents, questions, and consider some potential responses. So what I'd like for you to do, I think this is easier to start with, is think about in your work, where are there areas where you are looking to address issues of race? Or where do you think there are issues, concerns, barriers, incidents, or questions around race in your work? So I'm thinking real examples. And then I want you to think about what I've taught to you about Dakota worldview and those Dakota philosophies. How would you consider this issue? Could you apply the Dakota worldview, or are there pieces of that make sense in developing an analysis or a response? thinking about these kinds of things that we talked about. Does this make sense? So I made this so that you could have a little reminder of what I meant when of these kinds of concepts. And so my interest is that I'm trying to develop this analysis, but for me to do this, I need people in the world, people in the real world, think about, does this make any sense in their work? So that's what I'm asking you to do right now. And so I would give you maybe 7 minutes to sort of talk with some people that are sitting around you and come up with a couple examples, or at least one example, and then think about, is there any part of this that makes sense in coming out with some ways to develop an analysis around that issue or develop action. All right, so I'll give you 7 minutes.
And right away, it's hard to avoid. Or you think practically here. I really feel like this, so now I feel someone is
between the kinship and everybody. Well, I wonder if I look at with this person.
the fellowship is based on this or no?
Fellowship, all of things.
It's not really based on where. So anyone that, it's really interesting. Super article on about planetary health, and it was interesting. So I guess kind of, I mean, it those presentation of like there's such a different understanding. And in my
It's like,
and what it is, hard to explain to others what it is, and finally realize there are no, well, and like there is universal understanding. Okay, there is no easy, which, and just the idea, I think that there's like understanding the relationship between labor and standard teacher. I think it's really that's broad.
because people have the person has to do their statement and prove that
And I think that's kind of
people think about this.
hallway. There's that's like a photo of the tree on the cover. I think and that is Spanish, so you could use them for other purposes.
Really trying to take him.
It is like it's not the story. Like I increase the and like he but it and it does like now that's this like so like when you tell a story it's hard that it's have that thank you and that's walks the reader along to understand the story, but then you are taking care of and support, like so I there's a lot of things about preparing to like that super hard how important it is when and so what how it aligns like where the fire story. Yeah.
Right.
But
over there, but I was halfway to finish.
And what we're doing. So one of the courses.
Oh, yeah.
We know that our color and people are disproportionately impacted by all kinds of threats, especially climate change. And so how do we right that way? We know that then whatever actions we take, this work, that doesn't exponentially more work, our care trying to work to address that pain. It's really hard because the staff members, I don't know, American or white women, and so we've had to intentionally seek out organizations that would do interactive. So active recruiting those groups, but and so I'm struggling with the relationship building of how well, it's more like right. And so we decide 50%. I think this is, and then we have mentors. So the kind of community I should also work in very community focused. They're going to improve project in community. There's that. And then we decide where all the mentors there start with ourselves. Otherwise, I'm kind of, you know, vulnerable cast. What are some and then we were I don't really, this is really valuable. Yeah. We got it. Right.
All right. 7 minutes up.
You're here of the representation. It's kind of like
I'm very curious to hear what your analysis is. And of course, if it doesn't have much meaning, that's fine too. So let's hear from some of the groups that have something they want to share. Even about you, in 7 minutes, you wouldn't have had to come up with a solution. But just sort of, what was sort of part of the conversations that you were having?
That conversation.
Yeah.
So we wondered if this person would be able to get tenure or promoted, because there's so much about individual contribution, first author, grant funding. And, we did think that maybe the tenure process was like a considered decision-making process, because the individual has to do their own statement, and then other people review the statement, and then so that was one thought. And then, do you want to talk about your strategy? Give it away.
No, I can't. Nobody will come see me anymore. Well, I think what really resonated with me was that line, we are all relatives. Because when you're working in my work, I have people coming to see me that are often very upset. And sometimes I just want to say, grow up. I can't say that. But if you can kind of put it in perspective, it's a whole lot easier to react, maybe with a little more compassion, if I can visualize my sister sitting there, or my brother sitting there, or my mom sitting there, instead of this person who's just irritating me. And so that resonated with me.
Okay, I'd like to respond to the tenure one first, because I did go through the tenure system, and it was very difficult to sort of brag about yourself over the course of many, many, many pages, right? And so in a Dakota worldview, there would be that we never have to brag about ourselves because it is sort of the role of the people who know the work that we do to brag for us, right? So I shouldn't ever have to say, I did this and I'm so great, and I did these things, because people that are around me who know what I'm doing will say, oh, she did this and it was so great. That essentially it's not like your individual efforts aren't important. Your individual efforts are very important. And it's not like that you should just pretend like they're meaningless. But essentially it's the role of other people who know your work to sort of elevate you and to raise you up. So that is one thing. I would also say, those of us who are faculty members, do we think that the tenure process is a humane process? So sometimes it's looking about what are the constraints that we're in, because there are constraints. It's not like I do not have access to always live into this. Sometimes the constraints that are put before me limit what I can do. But I would also say that we should not pretend like the way the system is currently right and fair and is good for any of us, really. I think those of us who've gone through that process, I mean, it feels good to get out the other side. But I don't know, maybe I'll just speak on, in my past experiences, that it's miserable, I would say, but then people who went through it some people who have gone through it also want, well, I went through that misery and everyone else should have to go through the same misery that I went through. And is that really is that a world, is that a community we want to live in? Instead of recognizing what is miserable about the process, in what ways do we have any control over this process? And I think we have some control. A lot of the way a tenure process goes through has something to do with the culture of the department, right? It's not to say that they have 100% authority, but and also thinking about tenure as not something that happens in X year, but that it's a process that is from 1 to that year, from 1 to 5 or 1 to 7. And so thinking about how are we good relatives to our colleagues that are seeking out to get tenure. I know some people think of that because people definitely did recognize that and treated me as a good relative and tried to maybe give me additional resources or to help me with real fair critique about this is probably not going to have the impact that, or this is not going to be as beneficial to you in that review as doing this. But also recognizing that the tenure is a total hardcore socialization process. And we have to think about what about that process are the things that we really need to change because we care about our students, right? And we care about our colleagues and our department and its success. And what are the things these are some unhealthy things that we've held on to because we don't know why. Yeah. So I would say reconsidering tenure is sort of and just general review is something that's worthwhile. But that just doesn't stop there. Let's think about the way we evaluate our students. And we should come to the same, is this about real rigor because we care about them and we want to send them out into the world with the best skills? Or is it just a gotcha kind of thing, Okay, so that's that. And then the students coming into your classroom. All right, I would say
Employees.
Yeah.
Okay.
Director.
Oh, you're HR. Oh. All right, so but the same thing goes with that. Because I would just say, thinking about your good relatives. Do your good relatives always agree with you?
Oh, heck no.
Do your good relatives coddle you? Or sometimes your good relatives kick you in the butt, right? Your good relatives tell you a thing that you didn't want to hear. Your good relatives help you get to the point where you make that realization yourself. So being a good relative is not about nice. Being a good relative is really thinking about their best interests. And sometimes their best interests require you to be the bearer, to sort of be tough love, is that what they call it? Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily about niceness. It's about, I'm thinking about where you're at, and I want you to be in the best place, to be the most healthy, to be happy, to be fulfilled. And sometimes to get there, you're telling them stuff that they might not want to hear. And that is the role of a good relative. Yeah. Any other group? Yes.
And this would be with students or employees. The first step of a good relative is to listen.
Yes.
While they're, yelling and hollering, maybe all you have to do is listen for a while.
Yes. And I know this can be gendered too, because my experience is sometimes in those times, I just want to vent, and then I want the listener to say, "You're not crazy," and then it takes so much of the power out of it that I'm like, "All right, I think I can figure it out."
Yeah.
Sometimes when you do that with a person who thinks of themselves as like they're going to fix you or solve your problem, you're like, I'm just trying to vent, and then they are trying to solve, I'm like, I didn't need that from you. Some of it is the way you communicate too. So yes, being a good listener, and I think the other thing that starts with this being a good relative is a relationship. So you cannot, it's very difficult to deliver, even if it's good or bad news. The relationship is the foundation on which all of this begins. So the idea might be, I'm going to think more about how do I develop relationships with people. I'm going to think more about how do I develop relationships with my students. And to me, community in the classroom is so important. I see that my students, when there's community in the classroom, their internal capacity to make shifts is much greater. And I think the same thing would go with employees and with your colleagues. The relationship has to be the first thing. And that's not nothing. That's significant effort. Yeah. All right. Other groups that want to? Yeah.
I'll just mention for student services, it's similar to tenure, I think, when we think of the admission process. And think of, we want the best of the best. We want the students who have, sailed to the top of their class, who've gotten the best standardized test scores. But I think we do a good job of holistically looking at applicant. But I'm just thinking of, the community-based and thinking of GRE scores are just systemically racist, and how do we
not a great indicator of success either.
Exactly.
Right.
So how do we take this lens looking at admission processes, thinking of how to?
And this is kind of off topic, I guess, but I think thinking about the students that I've worked with, and in a way thinking about myself too, the people who on paper are the best of the best often, not always, but often have the characteristics of being rule followers. And there's a role for that in our systems. It's not about everyone should be super creative or whatever. There's a role for that. I believe I'm much more of a rule follower. But at the same time, we think about who we're sending out into the workforce, who we're bringing into the community of students, and to have 100% of a very similar type of personality is really not serving our students very well, because we know when they go out into the world, they're not going to be only working with, and their patients are not going to be people that are all like that either. So thinking about actually what are the benefits of a diverse, and I don't mean even just racially, but what are the benefits of a diverse class body, student body? Some of it is sort of the orientations, and I think the typical ways that we measure students, certain kinds of personalities or the way people make decisions, those tend to sort of rise to what we would now call the top. So I think, oh, that freaked me out. What's up, man? So I'm thinking about our systems. What I want you to think about is there may be things in our system that work well for us, but don't just assume that they're functioning because we've never tried anything else, or we haven't thought deeply about any other way.
How do we look at, I've been reading more and more about who succeeds, and, we know that a lot of kids getting ready for college are prepped, and they prep for this exam, they ought to go way up, and a lot of people never did. But the term, this characteristic of grit is getting more. And grit has, they talk about those with grit, maybe those who succeed, but I don't know how we measure it, and I don't know how we look at it when they are interviewing. But I do believe in that, and I don't know how it.
How do you make sure that is one of the factors or one of the features?
Because it brings something to the group. It strengthens our work.
And I think that if you really are also engaging in anti-racism, you recognize that the way that student X and student Y go through American systems are not the same. And that is really critical. We should not assume that our systems are an equal playing field, or they are not level. So then we think about sort of, in what ways are we sort of advancing equity, right? Equity, where everyone gets what they need to be successful. It doesn't look the same from me to this person to this person. And of course, that is a real challenge for systems. It pushes on systems to sort of have, sort of be able to make nimble responses based on the needs of this student and this student and this student. Yeah. Yes?
You asked how the Dakota Way can inform anti-racism, and I think it's because it informs us of a different way. When you live in a racist culture, if you're not underrepresented, you oftentimes don't see it. And so bumping up against or being exposed to or invited to look at a different worldview allows us to realize we have a choice. It's not like this is the way it is, it's the way it has to be, it's the way it always was. It says, look, here was a group of people, our group of people, that have chosen a different way.
And there are other communities who would say, this looks more familiar to me. This looks familiar. So that is, these are not, I am sort of presenting a Dakota perspective from my own life and my own study. But you could do this for lots of other communities, and I think that these kinds of things are beneficial. I'm not sort of advocating that this is the only way to think, but I'm trying to think about like the work that I do and where are the intersections and where does it make sense. So I did give a similar talk at Duke University this fall, thinking maybe this is a Minnesota thing. Maybe it is something that makes more sense in the homelands of Dakota people. And I had a very similar I had an experience talking primarily to faculty, but faculty, staff, and students at Duke, and they very much found that this was even just to do the practice of trying to think that there is a different way, right? That's a benefit. We are pretty much out of time, but I'm happy to hang around if people had any individual questions or comments.
Yeah, I don't want to waste time. We'll talk.
No, go ahead, please.
My question is, with all that's happened in history, right, and everything that continues to happen with Indigenous communities, how do you continue to protect this and promote this and teach it so it keeps on going? Because a lot of this, for me, being an immigrant to the United States and being from a culture that's very community-centered, it makes sense to me. But I see the longer that we live in the diaspora and the more that we adapt and are asked to assimilate into these cultures, different cultures that we're living in, we start to lose some of these values. And it's becoming harder, especially being the oldest in the family and now being a mother myself, to teach this to the younger ones as well. So how do you continue to protect this?
I think the experiences can be very similar, especially if looking at the land loss part. I think very much like the oral traditions and the stories and the values created to sort of that are connected to a place. When you're away from that place, either because you're a refugee or because you choose to immigrate, it still has that impact. I would say everyone should have some awareness of the Indigenous people on whose lands that they live on. So even if this isn't a particular interest to Duke faculty, I would say they should be focusing on the Indigenous people in where they live. But I think here at the University of Minnesota, people at the University of Minnesota should be very aware of the Indigenous people on whose lands they live. I do think that the issues of protecting this or transmitting it to future generations is a challenge. I would say that certainly like the boarding school era was a real harm. My dad went to boarding school. And I think I'm the first generation not to go to boarding school in like 3 generations. So these kinds of things get passed down. However, I look at like a younger generation of Dakota people in my own community. There's a tremendous thirst in this. And I think that if we were to look at sort of general patterns of immigration, we see that like the children of immigrants and the generations 1 and 2 growing up in the new place tend to sort of buy in to some degree, but at some point there's a generation that wishes that they had learned those traditional stories and wishes that they want to go back to those traditional values. Now, for white folks, unfortunately, I mean, certainly many white people have strong ethnic connections. But in the history of the United States, many of the ethnicities that came to the United States in like the 1800s, early 1900s, in a sense, at some point, maybe even in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, there was some exchange. Like if you sacrifice your ethnic identity, you'll get the power of whiteness. And I think that when I talked about what's the harm to white people, that is a harm. That is. So I don't have like a simple, I think though, even if you were to talk to younger people, while there certainly is a lot of distractions with the loudness of what goes on in American culture, I still, and I'm thinking about my own students, they still really do have an interest. I remember teaching a class, I was a visiting professor here for 2 years a number of years ago, and I had a couple of Hmong students in my American Indian Studies class. And in the review, what one of my Hmong students said is, like, taking this Native Studies class made me think, I gotta hold on to my Hmong traditions. I'm like, that is ding, 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 ding. That's exactly what I want. I don't want everybody to, sort of, like, think that their culture stinks and they all want to be Dakota. I want sort of sharing about Dakota traditions to make people, to rekindle and interest people have in their own ethnic identities and the strengths and the beauty in all ethnicities. So that's kind of my goal, and I've seen that happen. So that's the other reason about teaching about cultures and communities that are different. Oftentimes spurs interest in your own ethnic identity, and I think that's a healthy thing for everybody. I hope I.
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you so much, and we really thank you for coming. And this is the 49th day of Earth Day, 49th year of Earth Day, and I think it's very appropriate we talk about all our relations. So thank you so much for sharing a worldview that can really offer healing to all of us.
Thank you. Thank you for your time and attention.